Well, we titled our book Forbidden Archaeology because we found out that over the past 150 years, archaeologists have literally buried almost as much evidence as they've dug up, and they tend to like to keep that evidence suppressed because it goes against current views. That's why we call the book Forbidden Archaeology, because we catalog that missing evidence. Well, I began my involvement in the book in 1984 when Richard Thompson gave me the assignment of putting some of the information that he had gathered up to that time in book form. And as I got more involved in doing that, I saw that more research had to be done in different areas, so we conducted more research. We got more and more leads, and it took about 8 years to put the entire book together. Well, I had no previous background in this field, and I think this is one of the important points to recognize, is that sometimes you need a second opinion. You need an outside person to come in and dig around. You can't always trust the experts in a particular field to give you a complete picture of the truth. So many professionals may not like that. Many professional archaeologists may not like the idea that you have an outside person come in and look at what they're doing, but sometimes I think that's necessary. I think we're talking about a massive cover-up. As I said, over the past 150 years, these archaeologists and anthropologists have really covered up as much evidence as they've dug up, literally. And we call it a knowledge filter, a process of knowledge filtration, whereby evidence that goes against the accepted theories tends to be screened out, and you don't hear about it. It's as if you could consider archaeology, archaeological science, as a big museum. Now, when you go into that museum, they show you some rooms where there are certain pieces of evidence, but what they don't show you is the many more locked rooms where there are pieces of evidence that go completely against the idea that human beings like ourselves are a fairly recent occurrence on this planet. So what Richard Thompson and I did in Forbidden Archaeology was take people on a guided tour of those locked rooms and let them in on the secrets. Well, we called our book Forbidden Archaeology because we wanted to take people on a tour of the locked rooms in the museums of human history. Because it's a fact, Richard Thompson and I found out in over 8 years of investigation that archaeologists and anthropologists have literally buried almost as much evidence as they've dug up. And we want people to be aware of that. Let them see what's there. Archaeologists and anthropologists tend to bury evidence that conflicts with their preconceived ideas about human origins and antiquity. According to most standard accounts, human beings like ourselves have only been around 100,000 years or so, but the evidence that we catalog in Forbidden Archaeology takes human history back tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of years. I'll give you one very good example. In the 1840s, an anatomically modern human skeleton was found 90 feet deep in coal in Illinois. And this was reported in a scientific journal called The Geologist. Now, we got in touch with the Geological Survey of Illinois, and they told us that the coal in the place where this skeleton was found would be over 280 million years old. Now, this is just one case, and in our book we catalog hundreds. Now, I'll tell you what this means. According to modern views, human beings like ourselves have only been around on this planet for 100,000 years or so, and before that you would have had only ape-man-like creatures. So to have an anatomically modern human skeleton appearing 280 million years ago means only one thing, that current ideas about human origins and antiquity are completely wrong. The kind of thing we're talking about isn't taught in schools because the educational system is now under the control of the people who maintain this orthodox view. I'll tell you what kind of reactions we're getting from experts on this book. Now, people in mainstream anthropology and archaeology are screaming at this book. Now, that shows that they're taking it seriously, because if they could, they would ignore it. They're finding they can't ignore it. Too many people are taking it seriously. Therefore, they're trying to put it down. Richard Leakey, for example, wrote me a letter saying it's pure humbug. In the American Journal of Physical Anthropology, a review came out calling it dreck. But on the other hand, we're finding many independent-minded scholars, people who are professionally involved in geology and anthropology and other sciences, are saying that this is a great book. One geologist said it is bound to become an underground classic because it contains so much information that should be of interest to professionals in these fields. Now, an important thing to realize is that we haven't found just one or two examples. We found hundreds of examples of what we call anomalous evidence, evidence that doesn't fit the current theories. Now, this indicates something. This indicates that a process of knowledge filtration is going on. This evidence is being systematically suppressed, ignored, and forgotten for no good reason. What we would desire as a result of the research that we've done is simply this: that archaeologists and anthropologists take a look at this evidence and evaluate it in an even-handed manner. Now, that will be very difficult for them because they are completely fixed on this idea of a fairly recent origin for the human species. So this would be a very difficult proposition for them. But we believe if they looked at it without applying a double standard, which is what they tend to do, evidence that goes along with their theories, they tend to let pass without much scrutiny. Anything that goes against the theory tends to be subjected to unfair criticism. But we would say, just take a look at the evidence, evaluate it in an even-handed, objective way, and let's see where the facts lead us. Although much of the evidence that we record in the book was originally discovered in the 19th century, such things are still being discovered even today. And I'll give you a very good example. In the 1970s, Mary Leakey, it's the wife of Louis Leakey, who was one of the greatest anthropologists of the century, found at a place called Laetoli in Kenya a set of modern human footprints in volcanic ash that was dated to be 3 million years old. Now, this is quite extraordinary because, according to standard views, human beings like ourselves are only about 100,000 years old. So to find these footprints, which are no different than the footprints you would find on a beach today in ash that's 3 million years old, is quite extraordinary. Unfortunately, the mindset of the scientists who looked at these prints was such that they could not reach the obvious conclusion that the beings who made these footprints, which are exactly like ours, must have been very much like us. The only thing that they could say is that whoever was around at that time, whatever type of ape man was around at that time, must have had very human-like feet, which is something that's not borne out by the fossil evidence, because the bones, the foot bones they have of the ape men, the Australopithecines they're called, who lived at that time, do not match those prints. To support the current paradigm on human evolution, there's very little evidence. Now, it was Richard Leakey who said that the bones, the fossil bones that support this idea could be put on a few large tables. So we're not talking about very much evidence. Now, when you put all the other evidence on the table, and it would take many, many tables to put this evidence upon, the modern idea completely falls apart. The experts seem to have a lot of confidence that they've got the story of human origins all figured out. At least that's the image they project to the public. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of controversy going on. Actually, they have very little evidence, only a few fragments. Richard Leakey once said it's only enough to put on a couple of pool tables. And the interpretations of this evidence are very contradictory. I'll give you an example. Lucy, the famous Australopithecine, discovered by Donald Johanson. He says she was very human-like, but I was at a conference of anthropologists where many of them were making a case that she was hardly distinguishable from an ape or a monkey. Maybe she spent most of her time hanging around in trees rather than walking on the ground like us. If this opposing view of Lucy is true, it means we have to throw the whole theory of human evolution as it now stands out the window. Now, according to modern accounts, they have a bias, a preconception that we are very recent and that we have evolved from more ape-like creatures. And this idea is so fixed in many people's minds that it poses a barrier to their acceptance of evidence that contradicts that view. And as Richard Thompson and I show in our book, Forbidden Archaeology, there are huge mountains of evidence showing that anatomically modern human beings like ourselves have been on this planet for 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, even hundreds of millions of years. I'll tell you what all this means. It means that we have to radically rethink our concepts of human origins and human destiny. People, right from the beginning of Darwin's evolutionary ideas, they weren't concerned about how the butterflies came about, how the cockroaches came about. What they were interested in is where we came from and where we're going. So the evidence in our book showing that we have been around a lot longer than most people think means that we have to really rethink who we are and where we're going. Now, many people will ask, well, why don't we find evidence of humans in the same strata that we find the bones of the dinosaurs? But what Richard Thompson and I show in our book is there are pieces of evidence like that that do show that human beings existed during the so-called age of the dinosaurs. Now, admittedly, there's not a lot of evidence like that, but there is some, and it really bears serious examination. In fact, we've even documented cases of evidence for human existence before the age of the dinosaurs as well. I'll give you a good example of that. In South Africa, near a place called Klerksdorp, people have found perfectly round metallic spheres in Precambrian strata, over 2.8 billion years old. And some of these have parallel grooves, 3 parallel grooves around their equators. It's hard to see how those could have been made by anything other than an intelligent being. When Darwin published The Origin of Species, scientists all over the world began looking for evidence for the missing link. Now, what today's history books don't tell you is they found not evidence for the missing link that they were looking for, but they instead were finding all kinds of stone tools, anatomically modern human skeletons that place the origin of our species, or the presence of our species, back tens of millions of years. And that's very amazing. You won't find these reports in the current textbooks because they go against the ideas of human evolution that later developed. Now, many people will ask, well, if we're going to give up, the modern ideas about human origins, then where to next? And I'd like to suggest that we might take some inspiration from the great cultures of the world, because every culture of the world has something to say about where humans have come from. Now, I draw a lot of personal inspiration from the Vedas, which are the Sanskrit text of India. And among them are books called Puranas, or histories. And these Puranas say that human civilizations have been on this planet for tens of millions of years. But it's also very interesting, although these books were written thousands of years before Darwin, they also talk about ape men. Now, it isn't that one came from the other, but they both coexisted over these vast periods of time. And you can make a prediction. If you predicted from those Puranas what you would find if you looked in the earth for stones and bones and things like that, you would find pretty much what we catalog in our book, Forbidden Archaeology. Now, some people will ask, is there any other evidence for this idea that human beings have been on this planet for hundreds of millions of years? There's lots of archaeological evidence for it, but it's also very interesting that if you examine the great cultures of the world, the Egyptians, the Chinese, the Japanese, and especially the Indians of Asia, their histories tell the exact same story, that human beings have been on this planet for a long, long, long time. Now, most of the evidence that we catalog in Forbidden Archaeology was originally reported by scientists and scientific journals, and that's what makes it so compelling. But there's another category of evidence, and this is evidence reported by more ordinary individuals. And it is really quite mysterious, but nevertheless, I think it's deserving of attention. Now, I'll give you an example. In the 1890s, a woman named Mrs. Culp found in a block of coal a 10-inch piece of gold chain. Now, when she broke this lump of coal open, the chain connected the two parts, so it was firmly embedded in the coal. And this was reported in a newspaper, the Morrisonville Times. Now, we checked with the Geological Survey of Illinois. We found out that the coal from the mine that particular piece came from is from the Carboniferous, which means that gold chain would be over 280 million years old. We found out from relatives of this woman that they confirmed the story. Now, the chain was lost because after she died, it was passed on to a relative and nobody's been able to find it. But still, it's a quite interesting story. This is not just a hoax story that was made up, because investigators later checked with her relatives, and they do remember her finding that chain, and they remember it being passed on to relatives. Now, what's really amazing is that this coal was over 280 million years old. Now, what will modern archaeologists say about this? They won't say anything, because it is completely beyond the bounds of their expectations.